Welcome to HortTube, where we talk all things gardening. My name is Jim Putnam, and this is a Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum. This is Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum, a low-growing evergreen shrub with beautiful glossy foliage and lightly fragrant flowers in the spring. Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum can reach 2 to 3 feet in height and possibly 4 to 5 feet in width over time, which can easily be controlled, but it definitely grows wider than tall. It's a perfect little low dome. Most websites will list Pittosporum in zones 8 to 11. That's definitely where you can use them kind of any place in your yard, but definitely in zone 7. We use this plant frequently, but it's best as a foundation plant where it has some winter protection. Wheeler's Dwarf is a slow growing variety. It may only add 3 or 4 inches of growth in a single season, which I think is fantastic, especially if you're using it as a container plant or a foundation plant, because you're just not going to have to do a lot of trimming on this plant. It's almost self-maintaining. Wheeler's Dwarf would prefer to be in a half a day sun or more. It can take full sun, but I think they're more attractive if they're getting a little bit of shade during the day. So maybe a spot where you get all of the morning sun until 2 o'clock, or all of the afternoon sun maybe from noon until the evening. In terms of places where we're going to use Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum, like I've already said, in zone 7 this is definitely a foundation plant, and it's a great one. This thing is a perfect little 3-foot dome that's perfect under low windows, or if you have a low front porch, this is a great plant for that kind of space. We do have to be a little bit concerned if your foundation typically stays wet. We'd have to definitely take some special planting considerations for that, which I'll talk about in a minute. If you live further south than that, in zones 8 to 11, it can be used anywhere, and it looks great mass planted. It has this kind of two-tone foliage where the new growth is lighter than the other foliage, and it just looks great all season long. Wheeler's Dwarf would also make a great container plant in zones 8 to 11, but in zone 7, in all likelihood, it would be very damaged in the wintertime if the roots were exposed to the cold. Wheeler's Dwarf gets off-white flowers on it in the spring in small clusters. They're lightly fragrant. We don't always see the flowers in zone 7. They will take some late frost or freeze damage here. They bloom better in the warmer climates, and this plant's not really grown for the flowers. It does flower and they are lightly fragrant, but the main use for this plant is this just beautiful glossy green, tight, compact growth habit. In terms of planting Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum or any Pittosporum, our main concern is that these are going to end up staying too wet. This is a great coastal plant, and if you live down by the coast, you have no problem with that issue, with it staying wet between waterings, and you may actually want to put some compost or some cow manure or some peat moss in the soil when you plant it to actually hold a little water in place. But any place that has clay-based soils, you're definitely going to have an issue with this plant potentially ending up with root rot. So we're going to want to elevate the plant. And what I mean by that is you'll dig the hole the depth of the root ball and maybe twice the width. And if you have a soil that you think is going to hold water in place, especially clay, you'll want to mix some pine bark soil conditioner in with them. It's what we're growing these plants in, and it drains really, really well. You can mix 50% of whatever you pull out of the hole with 50% pine bark soil conditioner and use that material to replant your plant. After you've dug the hole that depth, we'll put about that much of that soil mix back in the bottom, maybe 2 inches, so that when we pull our plant out, set it in the hole, the plant ends up sticking up about 2 inches above the original soil line. We'll pull the rest of that soil up to the edge of it and tamp it down, and then very lightly mulch this plant. If you over mulch this plant, you're definitely going to end up overwatering it and killing it. So use pine straw or hardwood mulch and just have it fade out right before it reaches the base of this plant. Don't cover anything that wasn't covered when you got it. I don't think you'll have much issue with this plant being root bound. It takes a long time for it to root into a container, but if the roots are matted together when you pull it out, pull at them a little bit, and that will help them go outward in the future. But the whole process of raising this plant up and lightly mulching it should shed water away from it and prevent you from overwatering it. In terms of watering Pittosporum, if you had this at a coastal area, you might want to occasionally grab a water hose and water it in the summertime. Almost certainly you would have to, almost any plants that are in the landscape in a coastal area. But if this plant's in an area with heavier soils, clay-based soils, once it gets established, I don't think it's rarely ever going to need to be watered. It would have to be almost drought conditions for me to water this plant. And but if you do have to water it, saturate the whole area around it very thoroughly. Don't just water right at the base of the plant, and you should be fine. Maybe a couple times a summer is all you'd ever need to water this plant. If you put this plant on an automated watering system, you will definitely kill it or severely damage it at some point. I would definitely fertilize your Pittosporum in the spring. This thing has great new growth, and fertilizer will keep it growing all summer. Any slow release outdoor fertilizer would be perfect for this plant, and do it after the worst of the cold in your winter has happened, so sometime maybe around the 1st of April. One of the nice things about Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum is it rarely ever needs to be pruned. It's slow growing. It keeps a perfect little round habit on its own. Occasionally you might get 1 or 2 wild branches on it that are easy to cut off. If the plant gets much larger than you'd want it, you can trim it back. Much smaller than you want to keep it. Usually if I want to keep something 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide, I'll cut it a little smaller than that to give it some time to come back out, so I'm not constantly having to prune on it, and it has a more natural look that way. Don't prune this plant in the fall. I think you'd end up with some winter damage on it. This outer foliage is probably going to do a pretty good job of protecting some of that inner foliage. I'd prune this thing in the late spring, maybe in May, and that'll give it all season long to come back out and have this nice new foliage during the summer and kind of a protective layer on the outside of it for the winter time. Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum rarely get any type of foliar disease issues or insect problems. The main issue with this plant is actually root rot issues. If you plant them in flush with the ground and over mulch them or put them on an automatic water system, you're almost certainly going to end up with a root rot issue. Deer do eat this plant, so if you have deer related issues, I definitely use it as a foundation plant, or maybe it's just not a plant for you. So what are you waiting for? Even you can grow the low maintenance dome shaped Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum. If this video was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Also comment below with any questions you have about Wheeler's Dwarf Pittosporum. Thanks again.